Iran in a negative way because it's going to be drying up their coffers. And I found this really interesting article that was shown. Thank you, Space. I'll be reading this and then I'll stop recording in a little bit. But yeah, I found this this article and I was listening to the original Mark Z, and he kind of just pointed this out real quick. But I thought that it deserved a little bit more investigating because it sort of helps us understand what is going on the Iranian side of this closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I'll go ahead and start reading this article, which I think is very interesting. So it says, from leverage to liability, the Hormuz Strait is now Iran's biggest weakness. For half a century, the Strait of Hormuz was Iran's weapon. Today is its noose. The mathematics of energy have flipped, and with them, I don't know if you guys might be able to see better if I make this larger. And with them, the balance of coercive power in the Persian Gulf. Iran's implicit deterrent was geographic, spanning from the tanker wars of 1980s to the sanctions standoff in the 2010s. Almost 20% of global seaborne oil and a similar share of liquefied natural gas passes through the strait. The formula was simple. Any military confrontation that threatened... I should probably lift the camera up. I'm going to stop and restart and flip my tofu. Okay, and we're back. So, anyways, where we were right here. Almost 20% of the global seaborne oil and a similar share of liquefied natural gas passes through the strait. The formula was simple. Any military confrontation that threatened the Tehran regime risked a closure that would halt trade supplies, spike crude prices, bleed Western consumers, and above all, inflict pain on the United States, who was the world's largest importer. The strait served as Tehran's insurance policy and its most powerful bargaining tool. The threat was predicated on the regime itself that it could block everyone except its exports. The Iranian regime revealed its biggest weakness by constantly threatening to damage the global economy through a shutdown of the strait. In reality, a total shutdown has become has the most severe impact on Iran. Almost 90% of Iran's crude exports and about 80% of its total exports depend on the Strait of Hormuz. Depend on transit through the Hormuz. Through Hormuz. Around 25% of Iran's GDP and 60% of government revenues depend completely on having the strait open. Before the war, Iran was exporting roughly 1.7 billion barrels per day, receiving around 160 million in daily revenue from exports via the strait. Thus, Trump's full closure of the strait costs Tehran hundreds of millions of dollars a day in losses, not accounting for the additional fiscal and currency consequences in a country already facing an economic disaster with 40 to 50% inflation. The complete dependence on the Strait of Hormuz also adds to another weakness. 95% of Indian crude at sea is sold to a single buyer, China. Tehran is not selling into a diversified and open market. Its exports are sold to a monopoly that demands large discounts between $10 and $11 per barrel. So we had seen that recently when I don't know which one to push. But we'd seen that recently when we were talking about the sanctioned vessels being the only ones that were allowed to go through the strait, and those were the ones that were transiting to China. So, the tofu's delicious, by the way. Oh my word. So, the strait being closed is really kind of eating into Tehran's budget income, and they likely will have to dip into the reserves that they currently have, which is the argument that I was making yesterday in my video yesterday anyways. So these weaknesses were visible long before the war. Capital flight reached 15 billion in the first half of 2025 alone. The real collapsed against the dollar, and the government's budget, which allocated 51% of oil revenues to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, became even more dependent on a single export route it could not afford to close. When the war began, Iranian crude shipments collapsed by 94%. Then the United States' decision to block all Iran export vessels showed that Iran's checkpoint had become self-choking. In the past 30 days, 80% of the essential volumes that moved through the strait have been rerouted or offset by other oil producers, including U.S. crude exports. Yeah, U.S. and Venezuela. And if you go over to the video that we were just watching before, a point that he was, okay, so this guy, his name is Logic Before Authority, and his videos are very interesting, but he does show, and I'm sure you guys have seen this on what's going on in shipping. He shows this, but something else that he shows is the possibility of this being, and he goes through scriptural reference to all of this as well. But he shows the possibility of this being a Trojan horse, and how all of these ships could potentially be vessels that are filled with, products that you use in war. So it's just something to be just to consider, anyways. IRGC became even more dependent on a single export route it could not afford to close. When the war began, Iranian crude export shipments classified 94% of the United States' decision to block all Iranian export vessels showed that Iran's checkpoint had become self-choking. In the past 30 days, 80% of essential volumes that moved through the strait have been rerouted or offset by other oil producers, including U.S. exports, U.S. and Venezuela. The world is very different from what the Iran regime thought. In 2025, U.S. crude oil production hit a new annual record of 13.6 million barrels per day, making the United States the world's largest producer, but also the biggest exporter. The United States shipped around 5.2 million barrels per day of crude and 7.2 million barrels per day of petroleum products in March 2026, both global records. For the first time, America exported more petroleum than it imported, and by a net margin of almost 2.8 million barrels per day, according to the EIA. Total U.S. liquids production now exceeds that of Saudi Arabia and Russia combined. On the natural gas side, U.S. LNG exports reached well over 15 billion cubic feet per day, surpassing Qatar and Australia to make the United States the world's largest liquefied natural gas exporter. While U.S. dry gas production exceeds the combined output of Russia, Iran, and China, furthermore, The United States is also the world's largest producer of nuclear electricity at roughly 30% of global generation and a global leader in renewable energy. That's something else to consider. Not only are we building all of these data centers and sparking the need to create more power plants, but power generation has been granted, like authority to create one's own power generation has been granted to these data center, the people who are building these data centers. So not only are we going, and I think that a lot of it's going to be nuclear, because we're right there on the precipice of nuclear power generation that's like on a small scale, like micro nuclear reactors. If you look at Rolls-Royce, they have thermonuclear reactor propulsion systems ready to go. They just need the approvals and things like that, and they'll be ready to start sending nuclear propelled, obviously not leaving Earth via nuclear propulsion, but already in space, which kind of lines up with SpaceX Starship program. They're going to be constructing ships in space that'll never come into Earth, like Earth's atmosphere. They might come into Earth's geosynchronous or low Earth orbit in Earth's gravity well, but we're talking about spaceships that are going to be built in space and fly around in space, and the propulsion methods that are nuclear have already been developed and built by Rolls-Royce and other companies as well. NASA said that like by 2028 they want to have nuclear propulsion built and tested, but it's obviously going to take way longer because it's NASA and it's a government institution. But private entities, I think, that are going to start leading the way, like SpaceX has with rocket engineering and like satellites and all sorts of things like that. So with all of that said, I think that it's definitely possible that we're going to see more power generation taking place here in America in the very near future, because we are building all of these data centers, and they're going to build not just enough energy to feed the data center, but they might as well build enough energy to make money off of it while feeding the data center, and also excess of energy for nearby power grids to support the power grid. And also like having multiple points of power generation spread across all of America would be a lot safer, even though like these like stations are like the hot points that they would attack in like a terrorist attack against the US in order to shut the grid down. It would definitely be a lot easier to put back up and get up running if there was multiple points of power generation and not just a few of them. So that's something to consider. But I do think that this will all sort of help increase the exports of oil from the United States to other countries. And we'll see more of that in the near future. But on the other side of it, it's interesting to consider what this guy's video talks about, because we do now have a surplus of ships coming through here. And if you look at the Economist World Ahead 2026 cover, then you will see that there's a shipping container that has been converted into a war machine, and it's shooting bullets at America's 250th birthday. And then if you dig a little bit deeper into that, by the way, the Economist cover, I'm sure you guys already know, is like a huge, conspiracy thing, and it really does tell you exactly what's going to happen the next year anyways. But yeah, there's like a lot of pictures out there that you can look for that China has already developed these weapons systems, so that they can turn um, their fleets of cargo ships into war machines. So it's just interesting to consider all of these different things, because who knows what's actually going on. And, I don't know. And just another thing, this guy goes through all these Bible verses and whatnot. And the amount of he's not pointing it out, but I have found a ton of Freemasonry symbolism in the Bible, and it's just interesting to think that this is the playbook that they're using, and this is the timeline that they're using. And hello, I'm recording a video right now. I'll be done in a minute. But this is the timeline that they're using, and it's all from the Bible. And I believe in WWJD, but a lot of the other stuff in the Bible, I'm a little bit more skeptical to, especially when things like this are being pointed out, like exactly how Mystery Babylon is supposed to fall, and the nations of these Persian nations are all supposed to team up against us. And if you also consider the merger between CNN, Warner Brothers, Paramount, NBC, Nickelodeon, every single form of media that we're about to, consume as a nation is all going to be owned by the Middle East. There's a lot of Saudi Arabian, Qatari, shareholders that are going to be the majority of ownership in this new media company that is being orchestrated by Larry Ellison. So it's just something to consider. But anyways, it's a little bit interesting. These rabbit holes are very, very interesting. The world is very different from what the Iran regime thought in 2025. U.S. crude oil. Oh yeah, so this is what the U.S. has done. So we're, a leader in renewable energy. When President Trump could say in April 2026 that the United States was clearing the strait as a favor to countries around the world, including China, Japan, Korea, and Germany, the framing was an accurate description of who needs the Hormuz open and who does not. Only 4% of the traffic through the strait goes to the United States, according to SP Global. According to the International Energy Agency, IEA, throughput at the strait collapsed from its long-run average of about 20 million barrels per day to 3.8 million since the beginning of the war through the second week of April. Daily ships transits fell roughly 95%. The Tehran regime, in a gesture more theatrical than realistic, attempted to levy $2 million toll on each vessel crossing the strait without understanding that the move showed desperation instead of leverage. The U.S. response has been the most important measure deployed against Iran and in 2 decades of standoffs. Operation Economic Fury established a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. Iranian naval losses in the last 38 days of combat exceeded 150 vessels. The ceasefire framework under negotiation requires Iran to reopen Hormuz, but the U.S. maintains control. Thus, negotiations revolve around Iranian dismantlement, not American concessions. So, I guess we can read the rest of that. Concessions. The lesson is not just that Iran miscalculated, but that it massively underestimated its oblivious weaknesses. The United States is not a hostage of the Gulf. It is the guarantee of its safe sea lanes. Europe is tied to U.S. LNG while keeping a substantial Russian dependence, which complicates its energy security and makes it vulnerable to fluctuations in supply and price from both sources. Asia's largest economies, particularly China, are suffering the marginal cost of a Hormuz disruption, which has led to increased energy prices and supply chain uncertainties that further exacerbate the economic challenges. Iran's economic nightmare has only started, which is, again, the reason why I felt like it would be an interesting sort of thought experiment to consider that the Strait of Hormuz being closed would cause Iran to dip into the financial holdings that they already have, which apparently is not much. And that's the reason why I think that Iran, we'll probably see Iran make more irrational decisions in the near future, because they're going to be frustrated about the fact that the Iraqi dinar is not revalued, and they're not able to see the revaluation of the dinar. So more than likely, in my opinion, I think that they're going to start selling off, like maybe in equal proportions, the gold and dinar, just to sustain their, their operations and everything. But I think that they're going to be holding on to the dinar as long as they can. 3 important factors must be considered. First, the traditional Hormuz risk premium in Brent, which refers to the additional costs added to oil prices due to geopolitical tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, is structurally smaller than in the 2010s because U.S. supply can absorb shocks that previously had no substitute. The Brent price is lower in real and nominal terms than in 2008, 2018, and 2022 peaks. Second, the strength of American energy, including economics, export infrastructure, and LNG capacity, has become a key global geopolitical variable influencing global energy prices and the strategic decisions of other nations. Third, Iran's economy has not only suffered damage, it has also been demolished, which is interesting. Iran has lost $220 billion of damage so far in this war, and they make like $500 million a day through all of their transactions. I know that this one said 180, but I've heard 500 million a day before. So it would take a long time that's why Iran is seeking retribution or payment from America for the war, and they're trying to blame everything on America, because they're feeling it, definitely. So anyways, it's influencing global energy prices and the strategic decisions of other nations. Third, Iran's economy has not only suffered damage, it has also been demolished, and its extremely weak fiscal position indicates that it cannot sustain the threat posture in Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz remains the world's most important checkpoint. However, a choke point hurts whoever depends on it most, and Iran relies on it completely. The United States does not. The geopolitical advantage that Iran once held has now become its greatest weakness, likely leading to the disappearance of the regime's effective bargaining power. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, because and I'm sure there's, you guys can check out this video here. It's really interesting, and there are a lot of other articles. Yeah, this is the one that we just read, but there's another one here, and there's just a bunch that he's been covering anyways. But Danielle Lacal, Daniel LaCall is the guy, anyways. But it's definitely worth looking into. And yeah, I don't want this to go on for too long. I'm streaming right now, so I can't really exactly see how much time I've been recording. But anyways, that's what I wanted to share with you guys, and I hope that you found it interesting. And yeah, as Dinar investors, I think that it's a good idea that the Strait remain closed for however much longer it takes to see Iran start lashing out, because once they start acting irrationally, which they, I mean, you know, one could argue that they have been and they never have acted rationally, but I'm talking about once they start lashing out for no reason, I think it'll be an indicator that they're hurting financially and they're having to dip into their own pockets. And I think that the longer this plays out, it'll be in the favor of the Dinar investors, because that money's not going to, you know, go into that, you know, into the hands of the regime, anyways, the IRGC and the Iranian political powers that be right now, who have benefited from a lot of Iranian influence in Iraq's infrastructure, banking, and everything for the past 2 decades that we covered in the last video yesterday. So anyways, that's what I had to say today, and I hope that you guys found it interesting, and we will chat with you soon. Okay, bye-bye. And I'm done.